Hey YouTube, what's going on? Just taking a walk in the woods, taking a break right now. And I just kind of want to touch base on something I've kind of noticed in the last few weeks. There's a lot of different websites, blogs that talk about a lot of stuff when it comes to preparedness. And it just depends, of course, which ones you read and which ones you don't to get whatever information. I read more than a handful of sites on a regular basis. And I've just kind of noticed a trend. There's a lot of people talking about how to go about getting raw materials outside the homestead. For example, if you had to leave the homestead, which I do not advocate, I think it's better to stay where you are and weather the event. That's the whole thing about being prepared. You have what you need already. You don't need to go out and get this stuff. That's one thing I've kind of noticed with a lot of these stories. They don't really talk about how you can avoid going out. They just talk about going out and getting stuff. But you know, going back to the theme of these articles, they talk about going out of the homestead and going to places like, for example, junkyards, salvage yards, recycling centers. It could be a whole medley of whatever is in your area. You know, not everyone has all these resources. It could be that there's a construction site, and if there's a grid down scenario, or if there's like, for whatever reason, just a complete halt on activities in your normal society, there may be an abandoned or multiple abandoned type of sites. Then they might have resources there. So people are saying you could go and take that. Obviously, that's illegal. But I guess if you were just that desperate, you know, that's up to you if you want to break the law. But once again, it goes back to if you're prepared, you don't need to break the law. You don't need to do all this. And so, you know, there's a lot of people talking about, well, if you're in a more urban or suburban area, you could probably locate dumpsters, and there's probably going to be some resources in there. I'm not sure about you, but I'm not so crazy about that. Now, where I live, there's no dumpsters. You know, there's just, I'd have to drive pretty far to find an apartment complex that has a dumpster. But I guess it's a possibility that I could do that, but I would be so far from my house. In a worst case scenario, I wouldn't want to be that far. So that doesn't really work for me. But people talk about dumpster diving, and the thing about all this stuff, you know, if you really have to leave your home and leave your family to find more resources, first off, you're not prepared, and you can do a lot of things now to prevent you having to go out and being exposed to potential danger. And I'm talking about getting robbed, and really the other thing is really just getting injured, and it could be injured by other people or wild animals, but you could injure yourself. You could have an accident. If you're in a dumpster, for example, even if that dumpster is only a half a mile away and you feel comfortable making the walk and getting in the dumpster, you could injure yourself and not be able to walk back to your house. And it's just, there's a lot of things that can happen. And so why risk an injury, you know, or worse? So that's kind of what I got thinking about reading these articles, that there's so much emphasis on knowing where resources are in your area, which is good, and I'm not totally knocking that. But what about the emphasis on not having to use those resources in a worst case scenario? Because you're prepared yourself. And also, I want to say I've been seeing some really interesting articles on how to live in your vehicle. Of course, a lot of these articles are very generic or, you know, generalized, if you will, just because you kind of have to, because people don't know what kind of vehicle you have. And a lot of us just drive different things. So, I mean, I've actually been into this for quite a while, just interested in how you would do that. I've never lived in my vehicle, but I've owned vans before, and I've thought about converting them into maybe like a camper. I never did that, and I ended up selling them, but I just thought about it a lot, and I think it's pretty interesting. There's actually some people out there, it's a very small percentage of people, a small minority, if you will, of adventurous or whatnot that really do live in their vehicle, and they prefer it. They say that it's very freeing, a lot lower cost of living, and so forth. And they have really no problem. You know, as long as you know how to do it to be comfortable, I don't really have a problem with it. There are laws, though, in various jurisdictions. I don't know what cities and states that prohibit these kind of activities of living in your vehicle or calling your vehicle a home. But apparently there's definitely some out there. In my area, to my knowledge, there's no such thing as that kind of laws or rules or regulations. I think you can live in your vehicle just as long as you're not causing problems. But of course, I live in a rural area, and I think you can probably get away with a lot of stuff, Not that you should do things that are wrong, but I'm just saying, sleeping in your vehicle is probably the least of some people's worries. In terms of, that particular issue, though, I thought it was just kind of interesting, though, that you would see these topics about living in your vehicle and how to source materials outside the homestead. And it's almost like if you believe in mass consciousness or groupthink, that's what it reminded me of this, because I saw so many different people writing about this just recently. I was like, wow, I wonder if there's something more to it that we're not completely aware of. You know how we have like an unconscious mind, the unconscious and of course the conscious. And sometimes, we just are not aware of the full reality, even though we may unconsciously know it. And just because we unconsciously know it doesn't mean that we can become aware of it on demand. And I think sometimes in culture, you see this, that people sometimes write about things in a group or in a multiple, from multiple sources, and then the event happens. This actually happened on 9/11. There was actually quite a few people that predicted 9/11. And you can actually prove it because these people said these things before the event. And you can't really just say that that's been hoaxed, because it's right there. And it's interesting. It really is interesting how things kind of unfold. But I'm not saying that, something's going to be so bad that people are going to have to go and forage resources or live in their vehicle. I think sometimes there's just topics that are just interesting and fun to speak of and to write about, and I think some people just kind of get on the bandwagon and continue the conversation. And I think that's probably what this is. But, in the back of my mind, you kind of just wonder if there's more to it. So, hey, thanks for coming along with me and checking the video out. I have a new paperback book. It's on Amazon right now, and it's available in other countries as well. So go to your local Amazon site, whatever country it is, and look it up. It's Project Readiness. And there's a link to the American market, the Amazon.com American market link is in the description box. And so feel free to check that out. It's a really cool book. And so what do you think about this? Do you feel like that there's something coming down the pipe? I know there's a lot of sites that push a lot of fear. I don't read those sites, but I do know they're there. And what do you think? Because there's been people talking about the collapse forever, the end of the world. They've been saying that forever. Obviously, we're still here. Obviously, there's some problems in the world, but there's always been problems in the world. Do you feel like that it's getting better or is getting worse? Sometimes I'm kind of undecided about it. There's been some times, even a few years ago, I was very concerned about what was going on in the world. And right now, I'm kind of more on the fence about some things. I'm not so sure. I think that anything can happen at any time. So that's why we have to be prepared. And I think that's kind of the story in the end, is that you just can't worry about all these unknown factors. I'm sure there's going to be horrific things that are going to happen in the future. It's just statistically, that's just going to happen. But there's also going to be a lot of amazing, awesome things down the pipeline too. And we couldn't even predict it possibly. And we're going to be shocked about how awesome some things are going to be. So, does it balance itself out? Yeah, it probably does. In some way, it probably balances out, but how are you supposed to know, So you just do the best you can every day. And, you just try to learn as much as possible. And you put yourself in a situation, or you position yourself in a manner that you don't have to go out and forage for resources and expose yourself. And that's kind of what the takeaway on this video is that if you're prepared, you don't need to probably do, not even a tenth of what these people are talking about. And that's what kind of concerns me, is why are we focusing so much time and effort, in these preparedness articles about, leaving your home and going miles away. And, if it's supposed to be a collapse environment, there's a lot of dangers out there. Even in a rural area like I live in, I wouldn't want to venture more than maybe a mile or two if I had to, if it was a real bad scenario, because I wouldn't know if I could get back or not, And so I'd have to be very strategic. I'd probably cut through the woods to get to a location instead of driving. I think that's probably what I would actually really do. There's a lot of woods out here, though. So, I would have to really plan my route and know where I'm going, because you could pretty much get lost back here. And I have. When I first moved here, I got lost a couple times, and I ended up on someone else's property. And it was embarrassing, but I had to literally just cut through their yard and go down their driveway and find a street and try to walk myself back to my property. But I got a pretty good handle now of where I'm at. But, when you're surrounded by a lot of acreage, it's cool, and it's really nice in a lot of ways for privacy. But then there's also that aspect, though, that if you need to get somewhere on foot, it can take a while to kind of breach the woods to get to where you want to go. So there's pros and cons of living anywhere. There really is. And, I'm not saying that rural living is the best way to go. Just like I'm not saying living downtown in a major, major city. I don't know what you want. Just a large metropolitan area. I don't know if that's going to be the best either. I think that probably would be worse. At least for me, it would be worse. But there's pros and cons. I used to live in a lot larger city, and man, I'm telling you, I miss Walmart. I don't personally like going into Walmarts, but just the convenience factor, just to do pretty much a one-stop shop. I've learned how to live without Walmart, but it's I got so used to just going into a Walmart at any time of the day and just buying what I want and leave, and I'm done with it. And I got used to actually, being able just to go to a Walmart regardless of what direction I left my house. And there was 3 super Walmarts within just a couple of miles from my house where I used to live. And I just got used to it, just like a lot of people would probably get used to it. And you come out where I live and there's just no Walmart or no nothing. And you're just like, oh my gosh, you got to plan your day. So if you're it's like taking a day trip just to go get your groceries, and it's not that bad actually, but it can sure feel that way if you're trying to get things that are just not available, which most things are just not readily available in my area. You have to go to the nearest bigger city, and it's a bigger deal, especially when you have inclement weather. When there's snow and sleet or ice out, it's just really not ideal. But at the same time, most of the year it's very pleasant, especially where I live, and I prefer it. I prefer the peace and quiet. But, I talked about this in previous videos as well, that just because you live in a more secluded area or you live in a quote-unquote more rural area or less populated area, it doesn't mean it's always going to be quiet. I remember last year trying to make videos, and between the noise from the airplanes and helicopters, which I don't even know where they came from, and some of my neighbors being loud with power tools, or some of them having their kids out on four-wheelers going up and down the street, because it's so rural that we have zero traffic. So for the most part, it's safe to go up and down, even though it's illegal. And a lot of the kids aren't even wearing safety equipment, which I have a big problem. But out here, though, you don't typically just go up to someone and tell them how to raise their kids. They really don't like it. Now, where I used to live, you could do that and people would be respectful about it. But out here, you have to be really mindful that people don't like to be told what to do. And so I see a lot of things that are probably not right, and I just kind of have to deal with it, because what are you going to do? Have tension with your neighbors because you tell them that they're not being a good parent? So anyways, last year, I just remember the planes and the neighbors, even sometimes, some of my neighbors working on their vehicles, a lot of them are what you call their own self-made mechanics, good luck with that. But some of them do a good job, some of them don't. And they'll work on their vehicle or have, whatever. And it's just between that and also the gunfire, I live in a very gun-friendly area, which is awesome. And I have nothing against the gunfire, but every day, all day, even during the night sometimes, right now, I'm shocked that there's not gunfire. I mean, all morning that there's been gunfire. That's why I didn't do the video earlier in the day. But I wouldn't be surprised the moment I turn this camera off, there's like a whole bunch of gunfire. So there's just these pros and cons. Now, would I prefer going back to the city and having to listen to sirens every hour or every 15 minutes, or school buses and all that traffic noise and, lawn mowers constantly being done because you live like I used to live in a suburban area and you just hear noise constantly. Would I prefer that over this? No, I'm done with that. Sometimes you just kind of have to live with certain things. And I'm really rambling pretty long on this video, but just one more thing. The idea though sometimes of like when you live rural, after you live in a place that I consider this more of a semi-rural area. That's just me, but everybody else tells me this is somewhat rural. But I know people that live much more further away from an interstate. And I guess maybe that's how I'm judging rural is, how close is the nearest town, what size the town is, and, the nearest main roads. But there's people who live way off the main roads. And I have to say that's sometimes a little more appealing to me. I'm not so sure if I'll ever live that much more rural than I am now. I think this is almost as rural as I would want to go. But I have to say though, and chime in if you're in this situation or if you have been in this situation. Do you prefer to be like really out there, or do you kind of like being somewhere in the middle? Because I'm kind of what I would consider almost kind of somewhere in the middle. I'm not really close to any suburbs by any means, but I'm kind of like what I would consider like in between the suburbs and the really rural areas. So I'm kind of like, that's why I call it a semi-rural area. And so it's kind of one of those situations that I could get more privacy. I mean, I could probably, besides the airplanes and stuff, I could probably eliminate almost all other noise if I go further out. The problem out here is that a lot of the land that's in the really deep rural areas, it's almost like all just forest or woods, whatever you want to call this, is going to be considered like typically more of, I don't know how you call that. I was going to say just like investment property, but basically the lots are a lot larger, way larger than my lot or any lot in this area. And so you're talking about like 500 acres and more kind of as a standard, at least in this area. And it's really hard to find like a 10 acre or 20 acre lot. That's about all that I can handle. Maybe up to 50 acres, but what are you going to do with all that land, Since I don't hunt and it's one of those things. So you get to a point that you're like, okay, if you can't find a lot, of the size that you want, that's a big hurdle. And that's what I've noticed personally, because I looked, after even buying this piece of property, I looked for another one that was even more rural, just for the heck of it, just to see if I wanted it or not. And I couldn't even find it. And I think the smallest was like maybe a little over 200 acres. And that was really rare in this area. It was typically a lot larger, and it's just so expensive. So that's the kind of the thing that you run into, if you go very rural, you kind of have to luck out and find maybe a farm that got divided up into smaller increments, or just completely luck out and just find a piece of property that one small part of it got divided up into a smaller piece, and that it just happens to be for sale. And so that's kind of the thing, a lot of people struggle with is trying to locate a place to live and to build and just to kind of be away from everything. But once again, it's so awesome to be so remote. But then when you want something, if you have a need for resources, which we all do on some level, you might just run out of toilet paper, or you might have a craving for almond milk or whatever you're into. It's really difficult to be like, I guess I'm going to make that 2-hour drive to get my bananas or whatever. It's just, do you really want to have to make such an effort to get your basic necessities, So it's just an ongoing thing. There's always pros and cons, So, I guess it would be, the answer would be if you're like ultra wealthy and you didn't have to deal with getting your needs met, like you just have someone else that shop for you. then hell yeah, I would live in the most remote areas in the world. Seriously, I would consider that in a heartbeat. And I understand why people live in like the really deep areas of New Zealand or in the jungles and things. I understand that. I mean, I would love to be like really in the deepest heart areas of the world that is just remote and that, you're just left alone. Of course, I would want to have a lot of supplies, with me. And if I was that wealthy, I'd probably have some kind of like highly trained medical doctor with me too, because you would probably die if you had a real issue without some help. So you'd have to have resources, including people with you that knew what was how to do certain things. But yeah, to be a part of like a really small community that had the skill sets and the knowledge about how to do everything that a person really needs, that would be pretty much the ideal thing, and so anyways. If you've made it this long, wow, man, I feel like I owe you something. But no, I want to thank you for sticking it out and for watching the videos that I make. And if you've made it this long, put it in the comment section. I'd be really curious if anyone lasts this long. All right, you guys, take care.